Each of us live every day of our lives with a set of priorities. Big decisions, everyday small matters of life. We're constantly making choices based on our priorities. You've done that this morning, I've done that this morning. We maybe haven't consciously thought we were doing that, but we've done it. Will I do this thing first? Or will I do this other thing first? On every hand, what we regard as more important is brought to bear on our decisions. The boy comes home from school. What will he do? Will he go out and ride his bike and kick a ball? Or will he do his homework? It's an issue of priority. His pushy is probably his priority, but Mum knows what's really more important. Will I, as a father, take a potential promotion that will demand much longer hours and perhaps weekend work? Or will I stay put? Will I stay put in the job that I have so that I'm not robbed of precious and irreplaceable time with my family? Priorities. Will I take up that sport? Will I take that job if it means it will take me away from the public means of grace? Well, what do I see as more important? That will determine my decisions. Will I stay for the prayer meeting? Or will I go home to kick back when there are many hours left yet in the day? These and a multitude of other issues often boil down to the question of priority. Now, I know in all the things I've just mentioned there are other factors, but often really they boil down to priority. And friends, this morning we're considering from Mark chapter 12 what I've entitled A Question About Priority. Now, in our previous studies we've seen Jesus teaching in the temple in Jerusalem on the Tuesday on his last week. Remember? Like those huge waves at the beach when you're in the surf, you duck under one, only to come up on the other side to be confronted with another huge wall of water, and down you go again, and you come up, and then there's another wave, and you go down again, and you come up, and there's yet another wave. Well, Jesus has had wave after wave of questions from the various religious leaders. They were not sincere questions, but they were questions designed to trap Jesus or to discredit Jesus before the people. Remember the questions? He's had a question about authority from the chief priests, scribes and elders at the end of chapter 11. He's had a question about responsibility from the Pharisees and Herodians on paying taxes to Caesar. Last time when we were in Mark, he had a question about eternity from the Sadducees. And now one of the scribes comes with a question about priority in Mark 12 verses 28 to 34. Matthew says in Matthew 22:34, but when the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. The Pharisees hear how Jesus has just so soundly humiliated and silenced the Sadducees over their tricky question about whose husband is this after you've had, 7 and you die. After that, the Pharisees join their little huddle and they regroup, which brings us to right where we are this morning in Mark. And it brings us to the first of three things that I want us to think about this morning. And the first is the final question. And I say it's the final question because of what Mark records at the end of verse 34, right at the end of this paragraph, right at the end of the scene after this paragraph that we're looking at this morning. Mark has this little sentence that says, "But after that, no one dared question him." So this was the final question to be put to him by these religious leaders in this setting in the temple. Or we could say it was the last wave in the set of dumpers that have been coming Jesus' way on that Tuesday morning in the temple. Now, there's no doubt that the scribe who we meet in this passage is presented more favourable than the other men. But Matthew does make it, I think, fairly plain that this man didn't come on his own bat. He's a member of a team. And the team had a plan. They sent this man into bat for them. It doesn't come out in Mark, but if you turn over to Matthew's account, to Matthew chapter 22, we read in verse 34 and 35. The previous paragraph is that last section we've looked at about the Sadducees, and verse 34, "But when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. Then one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question, testing him." Clearly this question that this scribe, or lawyer as Matthew calls him, the question he comes with is a question in order to test Jesus. Perhaps it was that this man was quite impressed by the way that Jesus had answered the Sadducees. If you come back now to Mark 12, which is where we'll park this morning, in Mark 12, listen to how Mark describes the description of this man as he is introduced to us, verse 28. "And one of the scribes came, and having heard them reasoning together, perceiving that he had answered them well, asked him." So it seems that this man had heard the way Jesus reasoned. He saw how brilliantly Jesus brought to bear that Old Testament passage of Moses around the burning bush. He brought that passage to bear and to deal with this whole subject of the resurrection. This man was no slouch in the Old Testament scriptures. He was a scribe, according to Mark. This man was an expert in the law of Moses. He was a scholar, we could say, in Jewish religious knowledge. He knew all about God's written law. He knew all about its oral interpretation and its application. If there was anyone who could discredit Jesus on the subject of the commandment, it'd be a man like this. And the question that he puts to Jesus, found for us in the end of verse 28, is this: which is the first commandment of all? Which is the first commandment of all? Now, the scribes and rabbis had been debating this type of question for decades. Some commentators say centuries. You see, the scribes had categorized all the commandments. They had broken them down, or they had worked out that the Jews were obligated to obey 613 commandments. And they looked at that 613 list, and they broke that list into two parts. They broke that into 248 positive precepts and 365 negative commands, which was rather convenient. That's a thou shalt not for every day of the year. 365 thou shalt nots for every day they're there in the year. One of their favourite exercises was discussing which of these divine commandments was the greatest. Which is the first, is the question. Which is the foremost commandment of all? It's not saying which is the only. Have this one and you get rid of the rest. No, which is the first? There are hundreds. Which one is number one? You see, it was a question of priority. This is not a new question. They've debated this for years. And here Jesus has this final question put to him. Remember, it's a loaded question. It's a long debated question. Which is the first commandment of all? Which is the most important commandment? The scribes and rabbis had divided all these laws into not just the positive and the negative, but they'd also divided them into the heavy and light categories. And with the heavy laws being more binding in their mind than the lighter ones. But the problem they had, though, was that they were not able to agree as to which commandments should be in which category. Hence their debate. So this scribe comes with this question from the Pharisees with the hope that Jesus would incriminate himself by revealing that he actually had unorthodox beliefs. That Jesus would put one of the lighter commandments in the wrong place. Which is the foremost? Which is the first commandment? That's the final question. Now, secondly, think with me about the full explanation. We come now to verse 29 to hear Jesus' response. Jesus answered him, "The first of all the commandments is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." Now, in the first place, Jesus quotes what the Jews called the Shema. Shema is the Hebrew word for the first word in the English quote there, the word hear. Shema. And this Jewish confession of faith, the Shema, is what they call the whole sentence, which is actually more than what Jesus quotes here from Deuteronomy 6. But the Jewish confession of the Shema was quoted by the Jews every morning and every evening. And apparently it's still used today at the commencement of a Jewish synagogue service. Now, in this Shema that Jesus quotes, we have the root of Jesus' answer. The basis of obedience to any of God's commands is God's character. He is the one God. He is the only God. He is the one that all are obligated to obey. You see, it's not just Jews who might quote the Shema, but all mankind are under obligation to obey the one true God. Whether they acknowledge it or not, there's a sense in which we can say He is their God. For the simple reason, there is no other God. The Lord is one. In verse 30, he goes on then and says, "And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. This is the first commandment." Now Jesus, remember, is not making this up as something new. He's quoting from the Old Testament. And Jesus is reiterating it, and he's saying that our greatest duty is to love the one true God. My number one priority, your number one priority in life is to love the one true God. This is not just for Jews. This is for all mankind. He created all men. He sustains all life. He provides for all of us. And this primary duty before God is to be done with everything that we are. This commandment, as we've seen, to love God must flow out of a knowledge of who this God is. And we are to love Him fully. So God must be the supreme object of our love and devotion. God must be the foremost in everything that we are. And according to the language of the verse, this love for God is to engage my heart. It is to engage my soul. It is to engage my mind. It is to engage my strength. This is God's commandment to me. This is God's commandment to you. And God says, you are to love me with your heart. All your affections are to be set to me, he says. I am to be your chief delight. Yes, there may be other delights, but I am to be the number one. I am to be your chief joy above anything and anyone else in this life. You are to love me with your soul. Your entire being, the totality of all that you are, is to be given to me. You are to love me, he says, with your mind. Our mental powers, our thoughts, our intellectual ability is to be for him. God says you are to love me with your strength. You and I are to give God our all. We are to glorify him in everything in life. That means we are to glorify him whether we are at work. We are to glorify him at home. We are to glorify him in our sports. We are to glorify him whether we're eating or whether we're drinking. We are to glorify him. We are to express this love. He is to be the chief of all. Now these various terms, heart, soul, mind, so on, they're not given to neatly delineate our humanity. It's given to underscore the completeness of the kind of love that God calls us to have for him. God calls us. He calls me and he calls you to have a single-eyed passion in life. And it's to love and glorify him. That's why we were made. We were made for his glory and we were made to enjoy him forever. That's why we are on planet Earth. To love him, to glorify him. And you notice the repetition, you can see it yourself in verse 30. All. With all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. Half-hearted love is not real love. And here we are commanded to love God fully and thoroughly. This is to be the priority of my life. It is to be the priority of your life. Yes, there are other things that we have to do, but this is the number one. This is the priority. Supremely devoted to God above everything else in life, above everyone else in life. That is what we are to be doing with all of our human faculties. All that we are as people is to be given to this priority. An example of someone who manifests a deep, passionate love for God, loving God with his strength, literally, was George Whitefield. Many of you know about his story. You know that Whitefield would regularly preach 20 sermons a week. Now they weren't 20-minute sermonettes. On the 29th of September, which was only a few days ago on our calendar, but on the 29th of September 1770, that was the last day that Whitefield preached in the fields. And you know his story. He often preached in the fields. Though he was ill and very tired on that day, he was actually on a journey. He was riding a horse. He was riding through a town that he wasn't planning to stop at. And yet the people knew he was coming his way. And the people urged him to preach for him. And the people had actually already erected a platform for him out in the field. And they persuaded him. He agreed to preach. When Whitefield mounted the platform on that last time, he was so exhausted from his previous labours that he literally couldn't speak for the first several minutes when he stood in front of them. But then he announced his text. Examine yourselves whether you be in the faith. And he preached for 2 hours. After that sermon, the exhausted Whitefield rode off to a pastor's home for the night to rest down. He ate early that evening and was going upstairs to bed with the candle in his hand. As he's walking up the steps with the candle in his hand, the front door was opened to let a crowd in that had gathered outside. And you guessed it, they begged him to preach, and he did. And he continued to preach until the candle in his hand burnt out. There was a young man who was travelling with Whitefield. And this young man gently rebuked Whitefield for preaching so often. And to this Whitefield replied, "I would rather wear out than rust out." I would rather wear out than rust out. Early the next morning, he died, worn out. Whitefield was a man who, yes, had a love for the souls of others, but primarily it was his love for God. If you've read some of his journals, some of his diary entries, you see it everywhere. He loved God with all of his heart, with all of his soul, and with all of his strength. We live in days of such apathy toward God, so much mediocrity, even in the church. And a figure like Whitefield today seems weird. Like, who'd listen for 2 hours anyway? If someone has a bit of a passion for God today, they're seen as strange. God calls every one of us to have a burning hot love for Him that is all-consuming, engaging our entire humanity, loving God fully. Jesus then moves in his full explanation to show that this thorough love to God is closely linked and manifest in what he calls the second command, which is like it. Look at verse 31. And the second, like it, is this: you shall love your neighbour as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. History records an interchange, conversation, between the famous Rabbi Hillel, who we have heard of before, and a Gentile who came to challenge Hillel. And this was his challenge: make me a convert to Judaism on the condition that you teach me the whole law while I stand on one foot. That's his challenge. Make me a convert to Judaism on the condition, teach me that whole law while I stand on one foot. Now obviously that Gentile thought that he was safe from becoming a proselyte, because he probably understood that the law was so detailed and contained so many commandments that he would not be able to stand on one foot long enough to hear it all and to be taught it all. Hillel answered him, and Hillel said, what you hate for yourself, do not do to your neighbour. This is the whole law, and all the rest is commentary. Now go and learn. And Jesus says, you shall love your neighbour as yourself. Your neighbour. We all know the story, don't we? Jesus taught that famous parable, the Good Samaritan. We know from that story who our neighbour is. It's not just the person who lives next door to you, who the postman delivers the letters next after he's put them in your letterbox. We call that person, those people next door, our neighbours. Well, yes, they're our neighbours, but neighbour means more than that. Our neighbour is anyone who we have opportunity to do good to. You know, when Jesus says, love your neighbour as yourself, this is not a command for the modern idea of self-love and self-esteem, though that's what some people try and teach from this verse. That's not taught here. This is not a command to love yourself. Jesus does give a command in this verse, but the command is to love others with the assumption that you already love yourself. The kind of self-love that's promoted today is absolutely contrary to the Christian principles of self-denial, self-sacrifice, and God-centeredness. According to the thinking of our day, the ultimate sin is no longer to fail to love God, but the ultimate sin today is the failure to esteem oneself. It's like as if the Bible is being rewritten today. And instead of us reading, "O wretched man that I am, who will deliver me?" we have the idea of, "O worthy man that I am, would that I could only see it better as a worthy man." We cannot buy into the modern idea of self-love, self-esteem, and still love God with all of our heart, all of our soul, and all of our mind, and have a God-centeredness. True love is selfless. This is the very opposite of the promotion of self-esteem, which is all about me. Doesn't Paul say in 1 Corinthians 13, love does not seek its own? It's a nonsense to try and make that verse promote self-esteem. That's twisting the Word of God. Whatever we are willing to do for ourselves, we should be willing to do for others. What we would hope others would do for us, we should do for others. And here Jesus shows that the second great commandment is like the first. Actually, it flows out of the first. You see, we need to understand this clearly in our day. Jesus is not talking here about mere humanitarianism. He's not talking about philanthropy. Now, as commendable as it is that Bill Gates has given up his full-time job at Microsoft and has given himself to his full-time role with his foundation and giving away his billions, as commendable as that is, Jesus is not saying that's what this is. The love for others that Jesus talks about flows from a love for God and a desire for His glory, even in the love that we have for others. There's this intimate connection between loving others because we do love God. We love others as it flows out of that love we have for Him. John makes this point in 1 John chapter 3 and verse 17. Whoever has this world's goods and sees his brother in need and shuts up his heart from him, how does the love of God abide in him? He says it doesn't work that way. You can't say that you love God and then don't express practically your love for someone in need. So we need to understand that the opposite is not the true either. That you can't just say, well, I'm loving God and that's a good deed in itself. And it is commendable. Jesus' teaching, it flows out of a love for Him. This is not humanitarianism. This is God-centered living in a needy world. And Jesus calls us to have love for all our fellow men. Not just the people of God. Not just the brother in need. Paul's words in Galatians chapter 6 and 10, we have often quoted them. Galatians 6:10, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all, especially to the household of faith. So yes, in the expression of our love for God, in this love for others, there is to be in that priority, the priority for a love for the people of God, especially to the household of faith, but it's not exclusive. It's not only them. As we have opportunity, let us do good to all. That's pretty broad. Now, it is true that there are needs in our world everywhere today. Some are very chronic and tragic situations. And we can't do good to all. It's just not possible. So there's this proviso. We thank God. As we have opportunity, that's speaking about God's providence. As we have opportunity, let us do good to all. So what are the opportunities? And we are to take them. This is why we are currently urging you to think about getting involved with this opportunity of practically just making some things that we as a church might be able to go and show our love. That is the love of God to our neighbour, to other people who we don't even necessarily know. We may never get anything out of this, that's not the point. But people who have needs. Children lying in a hospital, bored. They'd love a teddy. They'd love, if they're able, to pick up that pencil, those colouring pencils, and to colour in, spend some time colouring in. Pass the time of day there in that ward. If your child had a disease or was bedridden in hospital, would you not wish that people would sympathise with you and, if possible, help relieve your child and even make their stay in hospital a little more pleasant? Remember what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount? Do to others as you would have them do to you, for this is the law and the prophets. Now, we understand that all of you, like me, maybe not able to knit teddy bear, but maybe some of you could learn. Wouldn't this be a wonderful reason to learn how to knit for the benefit of others? Or maybe you can sew up the bags, have all the stuff together that we could hand out in an appropriate way. As we have opportunity, let us do good to all. Now, there are, of course, a host of other things that we can do in working out, obeying this command of loving others as ourselves. I've just touched on one that's relevant for us at the moment. The Berean Benevolent Bears. It's just one. We trust that God is opening that door for us, especially for you Dorcas ladies. You can do those things that can really be of a tremendous benefit and blessing for others. But we shouldn't just stop there and think, well, we've done our duty. We would encourage your creativity, your ingenuity as to how is it then other ways that we can express God's love to these people in need or other people in need. The Lord Jesus wants us to be loving and compassionate people. Yet we know, don't we, that by nature we are just all so selfish. I mean, don't really want to use my time to knit. We live in a society that is wasting away in its self-indulgence and its self-centeredness. And as Christians, it's so easy for us to be infected by the spirit of this age, being squeezed into the mould of this world. We need to ask ourselves the question, in all honesty, coming from this passage, these words of Jesus. Am I desiring and am I seeking the temporal and even eternal good of those about me with the same zeal and the same perseverance of which I seek my own good? Love your neighbours as yourself. Here Jesus not only lays out the greatest commandments, he shows us the whole point of the commandments is love. It's in Matthew's account of this very scene in Matthew 22 where Jesus also says, on these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. So Jesus is saying this is the essence of the Old Testament. No, it's not external rules and regulations, but it's love to God and it's love to man. Paul understood that. That's why he said in Romans chapter 13 and verse 10, quoting from the Ten Commandments, he says, love is the fulfillment of the law. Love is the fulfillment of the law. So Jesus summarizes man's whole moral duty under two categories. Not negative and positive, not heavy and light, but love for God and love for one's neighbour. And these same two categories fit perfectly with the two tablets of the Ten Commandments. The first four commandments, the first tablet of the law, that's an outworking of love for God. And the last six commandments, the second tablet of the law, is an expression of our love for our neighbours. You think it through. If you love God, He will be your God, and you will have no other. If you love God, you will not make images or idols. If you love God, you will cherish His name and not profane it. If you love God, you will gladly and willingly give Him His day, the Lord's day, setting it aside for His pleasure, not yours. If you love others as yourself, you will honour your parents and all in authority. If you love others as yourself, you will preserve and protect life. You won't waste it. You won't take it. If you love others as yourself, you will respect that man, that woman's marriage, and you won't interfere with it. If you love others as yourself, you won't steal, lie, or covet what they have. The greatest commandment is to love God fully. And the second is like it, to love our neighbour as ourselves. The full explanation. Let's move in the third and final place, and I'll be briefer here, to what I'm calling the favourable reaction. The man's come from the Pharisees, remember, with his question. Jesus has responded to that question. He's opened up that question by giving his answer, referring to what God has already revealed. Now, let's consider the response. Verse 32, so the scribe said to him, well said, teacher. Now that's like when you boys and girls have done really well at school in a test, and your teacher says to you, excellent work. Or, beautiful job. That's the idea here. Lord, you have said it well. I put you the question, and your answer has been excellent. He goes on to say, you have spoken the truth, for there is one God, and there is no other but He. And to love Him with all the heart, with all the understanding, with all the soul, and with all the strength, and to love one's neighbour as oneself is more than all whole burnt offerings and sacrifices. This man shows that he had grasped what is clearly revealed even in the Old Testament. That is, that God desires loving obedience more than all the blood sacrifices of the Old Covenant. Remember the words of Samuel in 1 Samuel 15, this whole scene about Saul doing the sacrifice and not obeying, but thinking he's doing the right thing by obeying the ceremonial part. And Samuel comes and he asks the question, has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Then he gives this answer to his own question, which is the part that we all know. Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, to heed than the fat of rams. It is better to heed the voice of God and to obey the voice of God than to pursue the fat of rams and to do this sacrifice all. Hosea 6:6, God says, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. I desire the knowledge of God more than the burnt offerings. This scribe had comprehended this truth. He understood many things. But most fundamentally, he understood that without God, love for God and love for one's neighbour, the entire Levitical system was a meaningless ritual. He had such an astonishing Bible knowledge, able to categorize the commandments of God. And when Jesus gives his answer to this question, he recognizes what a truthful and helpful answer this is. You have said it so well, Jesus. Now notice what Jesus does in response, verse 34. This is the last verse. Now when Jesus saw that he answered wisely, he said to him, you are not far from the kingdom of God. This was a favourable reaction. This man who responded favourably to Jesus' answers. And when he spoke in reaction to Jesus' words, Mark says, describing Jesus' response to his answer in verse 35, that he answered wisely. What came out of that scribe's mouth were wise words, were good perception. And then Jesus says to him, you are close to being in the kingdom. You are not far from the kingdom. But friends, near the kingdom is not in the kingdom. Near is good, but near is not near enough. You see, to be not far from the kingdom still means you're not in the kingdom. And it's good that you're not far from the kingdom. But in the end, it's not that good because you're still not in the kingdom. This man had comprehended what so many had failed to realize, that love is the fulfillment of the law. This man had an amazing knowledge of the then Bible. This man appreciated Jesus' teaching. This man complimented Jesus for his teaching on this day. This man had all of that, but still he was not in the kingdom. He knew about loving God. He knew that that was his priority. He knew that's what he should do, but he was not doing it. Nothing more is told to us about this man in the entire Bible. We don't even know whether he finally made it into the kingdom. You know, you haven't got to be a murderer or a rapist to go to hell. Just don't love God fully. That's enough. If the greatest commandment is to love God fully, then what's the greatest sin? It's not to love him fully. You will never get to heaven without this love. You may be near the kingdom, but not in it. And this whole thing is distressing. You know why this is distressing? Because I don't love this way. And neither do you. And no one will ever have this love until first we are given a new heart by God. By nature, we are selfish brutes. We need a new heart. And you will never have this new heart until you see your great need of it. Until you cast yourself upon the one who perfectly loves God and perfectly loves his neighbour, namely Jesus Christ the righteous. So this is not about, well, I've got to keep that law and that'll get me into heaven. No one can keep this law. We need to throw ourselves on Jesus. And then, when he gives us a new heart, we constantly need the filling of his Holy Spirit that we might be less selfless and more Christ-like from the heart outward. Are there any here this morning who are like this man? You're not far from the kingdom, but you're still not in it. You have knowledge about the things of God. You hear his word this morning. Maybe you even say, yeah, I agree with everything you've said. We should love God fully. I can see that. He created me. He sustains me. He gives me everything that I have. We should be seeking to show genuine love to others when we have opportunity. Yes, I agree with that. Love is the fulfillment of the law. I can understand that. But near enough is not near enough. Oh, that you who are not far from the kingdom this morning would come into the kingdom. We don't know what happened to this man. He does. We don't know where all you're at. You do. Ask God to give you a new heart. See your great need. Cast yourself upon Him who is altogether lovely, Jesus. And may God fill each of us who are in the kingdom with fresh measures of His Spirit, that we would love Him more, and that we would want to demonstrate that love by doing good to all when He, in His kind providence, opens up doors and gives us those opportunities. Without Him, we can do nothing. May He be pleased to work in our hearts today from His Word. Let's pray.